They met under gray skies. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Oregon. The air was damp, not quite raining, but thick with the smell of pine and old earth. Emily Carter sat alone beneath the overhang outside her university library, her fingers wrapped tightly around a chipped ceramic mug of peppermint tea. The world around her rushed by, students with earbuds, professors with briefcases, but she sat still, her eyes distant, like she was listening for something no one else could hear. Then came the voice. "You mind if I sit?" She looked up, startled, to see a tall young man, wind-blown hair, second-hand jacket, and the kind of smile that belonged in a warmer season. He held a notebook close to his chest like a shield. She nodded. He sat, opened the notebook, didn't say a word. For the next 30 minutes they didn't speak, but something passed between them in the quiet, the kind of connection that doesn't need explanation, just presence. Later, she would say that was the moment her life changed, and he would agree. His name was James Harper, first-generation college student, son of a mechanic and a waitress, dreamed of designing homes for families who never believed they could own one. Emily was the opposite, daughter of a woman who once had everything and lost it in a whisper. She was careful with her joy, deliberate with her hope. But something in James's hunger, his spark, called out to the part of her that still believed in beginnings. They fell in love quietly. No fireworks, just shared books and late-night walks, peppermint tea and peanut butter sandwiches. They made plans beneath cheap string lights in his garage apartment, sketching out a future that seemed both ridiculous and real. And on her 21st birthday, he gave her a gift, a tiny silver bracelet, engraved with two words, "Still here." Because no matter how hard life pressed in, she was still here. And so was he. But life doesn't care about bracelets, or promises, or love, not when it's hungry. And life, as it turned out, was starving. Emily found out first. It was subtle at first, dizzy spells, bruises that lingered, blood on the pillowcase. She thought it was stress, school, work, life, but her mother knew. Margaret Carter had lived it once before, watched her own sister waste away from the same disease, a rare genetic disorder, cruel, progressive, silent until it wasn't. The doctor confirmed it 2 weeks later. There was no cure, only management, only waiting. Emily didn't cry. She listened. She asked questions. And when it was over, she walked home and packed a box with James's letters, the bracelet, and the sketchbook they'd filled together. She placed it in the closet and shut the door. Then she sat across from him at the cafe where they had their first kiss. "I think," she said softly, "we need to take a break." James blinked, confused. "What? Why?" "I don't think this is working anymore." His voice cracked. "Is this because I'm broke?" "Because I can fix that, I swear. Just give me a little more time." She shook her head. "It's not about money." He reached for her hand. She pulled it away. "I just don't love you the way I used to." It was a lie, the worst kind, the kind told to save someone's heart by breaking it, and it worked. He left that day with tears in his eyes and a hollow in his chest. He never asked why, never called. And Emily walked home alone, wrapped herself in silence, and waited for the day her body would give up. But it didn't, not yet. Instead, time stretched out like a second chance she didn't ask for. And James? He disappeared into New York, into ambition, into the kind of life where pain looks like drive, and grief becomes fuel. 5 years passed, and then the letter arrived. The envelope had no return address, just her name in handwriting she hadn't seen in years, Emily Carter. She didn't open it right away. Let it sit on the kitchen table next to a dying fern and a cold cup of tea. But curiosity, like grief, doesn't stay quiet forever. Inside, there were 5 words written on a simple white card. "I found you. Meet me below." An address in Manhattan, a penthouse suite. She nearly laughed. James, of course it was him. Only James would send an invitation like a challenge, like she had something to answer for. She didn't want to go, but something in her, something stubborn and unfinished, said yes. She arrived on a Tuesday. Again, the city was colder than she remembered. More glass than trees, more shadow than sky. The doorman didn't ask questions, just smiled and called the elevator. The doors opened to polished marble floors and a view of Central Park that looked more like a painting than a window. And there he was, standing near the glass, drink in hand, suit sharp enough to draw blood. James Harper. No longer the boy in the library, now a man carved by ambition and wrapped in silence. "You came," he said, Emily didn't reply. He turned, walked slowly toward her, every step deliberate. You left, he said quietly. Without a word, without a reason. She held her breath. You didn't fight for us. I didn't have the strength, she said. He scoffed. No, you didn't have the courage. She flinched, but didn't argue, because he wasn't wrong. He set down his glass. I'm not here for closure, Emily. Then what? I want you back. Silence. And then why? He stared at her. I built everything. The company, the brand, the life, but none of it feels real. I thought I needed power, money, but I just needed you. She felt the walls closing in, the room too bright, the past too loud. I'm sick. James. His jaw tightened. I don't care. You should. I won't. She looked at him, and for a moment, she wanted to believe that love could outlast decay. That time could forgive silence, but she knew better. You're not in love with me, she said. You're in love with the version of me that didn't walk away. He didn't deny it. Instead, he said, then let me hate you up close. She almost laughed, but she nodded, and just like that, they were married. No vows. No guests, just a pen, a courthouse, and two ghosts chasing what they lost. It wasn't a home. It was a glass prison dressed in designer furniture. Emily stayed in the guest room, surrounded by books she never finished reading and windows that never opened. James worked late, came home later, sometimes drunk, sometimes angry, sometimes with lipstick that wasn't hers. He didn't touch her, not with kindness, not with cruelty, just silence, a war with no weapons. And then came Lily, the assistant with the red lips and louder laughter, the one who answered James's phone like it belonged to her, the one who wore Emily's scarf without knowing where it came from. Or maybe she knew. Maybe that was the point. Emily didn't confront her, didn't fight, because her body was already fighting enough. She had begun to fade. The illness wasn't loud. It never screamed. It whispered. It stole sleep, appetite. Hair. It made her feel like paper in the rain. But she didn't tell James, not because she was afraid, but because he didn't deserve her pain. He'd chosen this war. He could win it alone. P5. It happened on her birthday. Emily hadn't planned to celebrate. She had ordered herself a small cake, watched the candles flicker in the dim kitchen light, made a wish she didn't believe in. Then she walked to James's office. To tell him the truth. To say goodbye. But Lily was there, wearing Emily's perfume, holding James's hand, and laughing. Emily froze. Lily turned, smiling. Oh, you're early, she said. James said he'd be free in an hour. Emily didn't answer. She just looked at James. He didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't stop her when she whispered, I'm dying. The room fell silent, and then Lily laughed again. Drama much? Emily turned to leave, but the world tilted. The floor rose to meet her. The last thing she saw was the silver bracelet slipping off her wrist, clinking against marble, then darkness. The scream that tore through the office didn't sound human. It came from James. He dropped to his knees beside Emily's crumpled form, his hand trembling as he reached for her shoulder. Blood had pooled at the corner of her mouth. Her eyes were closed, lashes fluttering slightly, as if she were caught in some fever dream. Call an ambulance, he shouted to Lily. She stood frozen for a beat, white as paper, until her reflexes kicked in. She pulled out her phone. Her voice panicked as she relayed their address to the dispatcher. James cradled Emily in his lap. Emily, stay with me, please. It was the first time in 5 years he'd said please to her. Her eyelids moved slightly, a whisper falling from her lips. So warm. And then she was still. T Memorial Hospital. Everything moved fast. Emily was rushed into emergency care. Tubes, oxygen, monitors. James wasn't allowed past the white double doors. He stood in the waiting area, numb, his hands stained with her blood. Lily tried to speak. He held up a hand. Don't. She fell silent. Minutes stretched into hours. The ticking clock on the wall was louder than his heartbeat. He could feel it, a dread in his chest he hadn't known since his father's funeral. Then finally, a doctor appeared. Middle-aged, calm, tired eyes behind clear-framed glasses. Are you Mr. Harper? James nodded. His voice caught. She's alive, the doctor said. For now. But we need to talk. He explained the diagnosis. The rare cancer, the late stage, the internal bleeding caused by stress and emotional deterioration. She's been holding it together for too long, the doctor said. And now her body is done. James couldn't speak. She has weeks, maybe a couple of months. We're stabilizing her. But you need to prepare. He swallowed hard. Can I see her? She asked for someone named Sophie. Emily lay in a white room, sunlight spilling across her face like a final blessing. Sophie sat beside her, holding her hand. Tears streamed silently down her face. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Sophie whispered. Emily's smile was weak. Because you would have stopped me from staying. Sophie squeezed her hand. You still could have had a chance. There are treatments. Trials. Emily shook her head slowly. I'm tired, soft. I'm so tired. Then her voice softened to a whisper. But I needed him to know. Before I go, I needed him to understand what he destroyed. A pause. And I needed him to see what he lost. Sophie wiped her eyes. You didn't deserve this, Emily. I know. Emily exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window. But I loved him anyway. 3 days later, James sat alone in the penthouse. He hadn't touched a drink, hadn't opened his laptop. His phone buzzed every few hours. Investors, assistants, clients. He ignored them all. On the kitchen counter sat a small, battered jewelry box. He opened it. Inside was a velvet ribbon, the one Emily wore in her hair the night they first kissed, behind that bookstore in Oregon. She had laughed when he called her the girl with the galaxies in her eyes. He pressed the ribbon to his lips. Then he broke. For the first time in years, truly, deeply he broke. The kind of sobs that shake a man from his spine to his soul. Because now he knew. He hadn't just lost a woman. He had lost the one, and she was dying. Emily woke up to the steady beeping of a monitor and the pale dawn light streaming through the blinds. The hospital room was sterile, white, and quiet to quiet. Her body felt like it had been through a war. Every muscle ached, her chest was tight, and her mouth tasted of metal. But she was awake, alive. She turned her head slowly and saw Sophie slumped in a chair beside her bed, her face streaked with dried tears. Clutched in Sophie's lap was the worn sketchbook James had once gifted Emily. On the tray table near the bed lay a sealed envelope, her name written on the front in James's familiar, slanted handwriting. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. Inside was a letter. Emily, if you're reading this, you're still here. I've been thinking about what it means to truly be present, to be with someone, not just physically, but emotionally, completely. For years, I thought being there for you meant building a fortress of wealth, power, control. I see now that I was wrong. You taught me that love is quiet. It's the warmth and the silence, the hand held through darkness, the gentle laugh in a world gone cold. I've made so many mistakes. I let anger drown out the truth. I built walls instead of bridges. I let the version of me that chased shadows ruin the man who once dreamed beside you. But if you'll let me, I want to be here. Now, truly here. No promises, no plans, just presence, still here. James. Emily folded the letter, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She didn't know what tomorrow held, or the day after, but right now, she was still here. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. James came the next morning. He looked rough, pale, tired, but when his eyes met hers, they softened with something that looked a lot like hope. He brought peppermint tea, warm, comforting, and sat beside her without a word. You're late, she murmured. I had to get your tea. She smiled weakly. You remembered. He didn't answer, just watched her like she might disappear if he blinked. For the next few days, James stayed by her side. He didn't bring his laptop. He ignored his phone. He just was. They shared memories, laughter, even a few quiet tears. But outside that room, shadows stirred. Lily, she had seen James unravel at Emily's collapse. She had watched him disappear into the hospital and not return. And something in her jealousy, possessiveness, fear began to twist. She was not used to being ignored, especially not by James. So she started small. She forwarded old photos to James's phone once taken at events Emily never knew about. Ones where James's arm was wrapped around Lily's waist a little too tightly. Then came the emails. Anonymous. Emily isn't who you think she is. She left you once. She'll do it again. James deleted them without reading at first. But seeds of doubt once planted don't die easily, especially when watered by guilt. Emily noticed the change, subtle, but real. The hesitation in his touch, the late arrivals, the way he stared out the window for minutes at a time. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, she asked, "Are you okay?" He flinched. Of course. She studied him. You're lying. He looked at her, then really looked. and for a moment she saw the boy she once loved. I don't know what I'm doing, Em. You're scared. He nodded. I don't know if I can fix what I broke. She reached for his hand. It's not about fixing. It's about being here. But outside the room, Lily was already planning her next move. She wasn't done. Not yet. The hospital room was colder now. James stood by the window, watching the clouds drift across a gray New York sky. Emily slept, her breathing shallow, her frame fragile beneath the layers of thin hospital blankets. He had stayed. Through the guilt, through the doubt, through Lily's manipulation. Her texts had turned from subtle hints to desperate accusations. And when James finally blocked her number, she made it public. Photos, screenshots, half-truths dressed as betrayal. The media caught it. CEO abandons wife for dying ex? The headlines bled through screens. Rumors flared. Clients called. Investors panicked. But James didn't flinch. He stayed. Emily woke to his voice. Soft. Broken. Reading from a book they once loved, The Little Prince. His voice cracked when he got to the part about the fox and the rose. She opened her eyes. You always cried at that part, she whispered. James looked at her, tears caught in his lashes. I still do. You should leave, she said. They're tearing you apart out there. He shook his head. Let them. I found peace in here. With you. She closed her eyes again. You're a fool. For you, always. That night, Lily showed up. She didn't knock. She didn't ask. She barged into the room like a storm, wrapped in lipstick and perfume. I want to talk to him, she snapped at Sophie, who stood guard like a lioness. You're not welcome here. But James heard the commotion and stepped into the hallway. Leave, he said, calm but firm. Lily's eyes flared. She's dying, and you're throwing away everything we built for some fantasy? James didn't shout, didn't curse. He just said, we didn't build anything. I was hiding. Now I'm not. And he walked back into Emily's room. Emily was awake. She had heard everything. He sat beside her, silent, and for the first time since their wedding day, she reached for his hand without hesitation. And no fear, and no barriers, just presence. Still here. James couldn't sleep that night. The hospital walls felt like they were closing in. The soft beeping of machines, the antiseptic air, the ticking clock. It was a prison of memories and guilt. Emily slept peacefully beside him, her hands still wrapped loosely around his. But James's mind was far from peaceful. He kept thinking of Lily. She hadn't just shown up. She had plans, manipulative ones. She knew which strings to pull, both in the media and in James's past. She wasn't just jealous. She was calculating. And James was tired of being manipulated. The next day, James contacted his lawyer. I want her out, he said flatly. You mean Lily? I mean out of the company, out of the apartment, out of everything. I don't care if I have to buy her silence. I want her gone. It wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about James finally reclaiming his life. But Lily didn't go quietly. She leaked more than photos this time. She released voicemails edited out of context, painting James as a man who was emotionally abusive, erratic, dangerous. The media devoured it. James's company stock plummeted. His board demanded an emergency meeting. James didn't go. He stayed at the hospital. When Emily woke, he told her everything. I don't care what they say. I don't care what I lose. If the only place I'm still worth something is here with you, then that's enough. She touched his cheek, her thumb brushing the tiredness from his eyes. You're doing the right thing, she whispered. But what if I lose everything? She smiled, faint but firm. Then maybe it wasn't worth having in the first place. And somewhere in the city, Lily watched the headlines, her face cold, her eyes calculating. This isn't over, she muttered, because for her, it never was. The fallout was brutal. James's face was everywhere: TV, social media, blogs. Headlines screamed betrayal. Investors pulled out. He was called a villain, a liar, a man driven by lust and ego. And worst of all, some believed Lily. Emily watched it unfold from her hospital bed. I'm sorry, James whispered, brushing her knuckles, but she shook her head. You don't owe me an apology. You're the one being crucified. James didn't care about the headlines. What haunted him was the voicemail. He recognized the words but not the context. Lily had recorded a conversation they'd had months ago, during one of his darkest nights, when he thought Emily was never coming back. Lily had edited it to sound like a confession of love. It wasn't just deception. It was warfare. So James made a choice. He went public. At a press conference, he stood before a wall of cameras, his face drawn but clear. "My name is James Harper," he began, "and I have made many mistakes, but I will not be blackmailed by lies. The woman I love is fighting for her life, and while the world watches, another tried to exploit her pain for personal gain." He paused. "I was manipulated, but I will not be silent." Then, he released everything: texts, emails, security footage, voice analysis. Proof that Lily's campaign was a constructed narrative. It was risky, but it worked. The tide turned, slowly, and Emily, for the first time in weeks, smiled genuinely. "I didn't think you had it in you," she said. James laughed. "Neither did I." But across the city, Lily stood in a penthouse suite that wasn't hers anymore. Everything was gone: her title, her access, her control, yet her smile didn't fade. "Fine," she whispered to herself. "Plan a failed." She opened a drawer. Inside, a small black notebook, labeled "Carter Family Confidential." "Let's try something more personal." The notebook was old, worn leather, frayed corners, and the faint scent of dust and forgotten years. Lily traced the embossed title with a painted fingernail: "Carter Family Confidential." She had found it tucked inside an old safe in James's office months ago, back when she still had access to everything. At the time, she didn't think much of it. But now, with her reputation in ruins and James back in Emily's arms, it was her last card. She flipped it open. The pages were filled with notes, letters, medical charts, everything Margaret Carter had documented during her sister's final years. Emily's aunt, the one who died of the same disease now consuming Emily. There were names, dates, a pattern. Lily's eyes widened. The condition wasn't just rare. It was inherited and selectively silenced. There were implications, legal ones, medical negligence, cover-ups. Margaret had tried to sue the pharmaceutical company that misdiagnosed her sister decades ago and been silenced. Emily's mother had buried the truth to protect her daughter from stigma. If this came out, hospitals would be liable, trusts would be broken, Emily's own medical coverage might be compromised. It was nuclear, and Lily knew how to detonate it. Meanwhile, James was sitting with Sophie in the hospital cafeteria. He looked exhausted but lighter. Sophie slid a cup of coffee across the table. "She's better today," she said. "The new treatment is helping." James smiled faintly. "I can't believe we got a second chance." Sophie's smile faltered. "Then protect it." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean Lily's not done. Girls like her never go out quietly." James's jaw tightened. "Let her try. This time I'm ready." But he wasn't. Not for what Lily had found, not for the storm she was about to unleash. The first article hit on a Thursday morning. "Carter Family Cover-Up, Exclusive Files Uncovered." It spread like wildfire: forums, news feeds, talk shows. Lily had timed it perfectly. The leak wasn't about James. It was about Emily, about her bloodline, about a legacy of silence and shame. The notebook's contents were scanned, uploaded, and dissected by strangers. Why didn't her family say anything? Is she really sick, or is this a sympathy stunt? Another privileged story hiding behind trauma. James burst into the hospital room holding a printed copy of the headline. Emily was sitting up, eating soup slowly. She saw his face and knew. "How bad is it?" she asked calmly. He sat beside her, pressing the paper down. "They're tearing you apart." Emily took the paper. "Read the headline, then the subheadline, then the first line," and laughed, softly, bitterly. "They think this is new?" she whispered. "I lived this." James didn't know what to say. She looked at him, eyes sharp. "This doesn't break me, but it might break you." "No, I'm not running this time." She studied him, and for the first time, she nodded. A full, solemn nod. "Then let's do this together." By the next morning, James and Emily released a joint statement. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It was raw. "We have nothing to hide," it began. "The truth has already lived in our bones. It's not news. It's survival." The world began to split. Some rallied to Emily's side: survivors, truth seekers, people who saw strength in her vulnerability. Others fed on scandal. But for the first time, Emily wasn't hiding, and neither was James. Lily, watching from a hotel room across the city, stared at the screen, her lips curled. "Cute," she muttered. "Let's see how long they last." Because in her hand was a flash drive, and on it something even worse, something James didn't even know about himself. Yet, the flash drive sat on the edge of Lily's laptop. She took a breath, then opened the folder labeled JBH, Personal. Inside were scans of old documents, bank records, a court transcript, a birth certificate. Lily's eyes glinted, because there it was, James Harper, born 1990, adopted. His real name was James Malcolm. His birth mother was a teenager in Oregon. She had died during childbirth. Complications. His father? Listed only as unknown. But Lily had found something else. A scanned letter, never sent, from the adoption agency. It detailed a request from a private donor, the very person who had paid for James's education, paid for his early housing, the scholarships that appeared at just the right time. It wasn't random generosity. It was Margaret Carter, Emily's aunt, the woman who died from the same illness, which meant James and Emily shared blood, not directly, not siblings, but cousins, once removed technically. Lily stared at the screen, her lips curling with perverse satisfaction. This will break them. Across town, Emily had a rare moment of peace. She and James were watching reruns of old sitcoms, her head resting on his shoulder. They laughed at the same jokes they used to share back in college. "This is the best I've felt in weeks," she said. James kissed her hair. "Then let's make it last." But peace was short-lived. That night, Lily scheduled the email. She didn't need the media this time. She sent it directly to Emily. Subject: "You should know." Attachment: one folder. Emily opened it alone, just past midnight. Her hands shook as she read. She dropped the laptop and whispered, No, this can't be true." James found her on the hospital balcony. Emily was curled up on the bench, her hospital blanket wrapped tightly around her. The wind tugged at her hair, but she didn't move. Her eyes stared out over the sleeping city, unblinking. He approached slowly. "Hey." She didn't look at him. "I read it," she said, voice hollow. James felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Read what?" She finally turned to him. "Your birth records." His breath caught. "What?" "I know about the adoption. About Margaret. About the bloodline." Silence fell, thick, heavy. James sat beside her, stunned. "I didn't know." "I believe you." More silence. Then Emily whispered, "So what does that make us?" James didn't have an answer. He stared at his hands. "I don't know. Technically, distant, but emotionally, we're everything." Emily let out a shaky breath. "We didn't choose this. We chose love." He nodded. "And I still do. Every second." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "This changes nothing and everything." James gently pulled her into his arms. "Then we face it, together, again." They sat like that for a long time, the city lights blinking below them like stars gasping for air. And somewhere deep inside both of them, a truth remained unshaken. They didn't find each other by accident. They were pulled together by something older, stronger, unwritten. The next day brought rain. It hammered the hospital windows like nature itself was grieving. Inside, James and Emily remained wrapped in silence, not because they had nothing to say but because too much had already been said. James sat beside her, fingers linked with hers. Her skin was cold, but her grip steady. "I've asked the hospital to do a full review of the adoption and medical history," James said finally. "We'll get facts, not fear." Emily nodded faintly. "It doesn't matter to me what label they try to put on us. I know what I feel, and I know what you've given me." James looked into her eyes. "What have I given you?" "Peace, in a life that never had room for it." Outside, lightning split the sky. Inside, Lily's story began to unravel. Blogs that once celebrated her exclusive leak now questioned the ethics behind her campaign. A former assistant came forward, then a journalist. The story shifted from scandal to setup. Lily disappeared from social media. But not before she sent one last message to James. "You win, but you'll still lose her." James didn't reply. Instead, he brought a Polaroid camera to the hospital the next morning. He and Emily took a photo on the balcony, gray skies behind them, matching beanies on their heads, and the kind of smiles that could only be carved from survival. He placed the photo beside her bed. Emily laughed. "That's a terrible picture." "It's the truth. And it's ours." Later that night, as Emily drifted to sleep, she whispered, "If I go, promise me you won't let it turn you cold again." James held her hand to his chest. "If you go, I'll burn the whole sky just to follow." She smiled faintly. "Don't follow. Live." James didn't answer, because in that moment, all he could do was hold on. Days passed. Emily's strength returned in flickers, moments of clarity, quiet smiles, whispered jokes. But behind her eyes, the pain lingered. Her body was tired, her spirit was fierce, and James never left her side. Doctors spoke in hushed tones. The treatment had slowed the progression, but the clock had not stopped. Every good day was a gift. Every night, a silent prayer. Emily asked for something simple. I want to go home. James hesitated. Are you sure? I want to fall asleep in real sheets. Hear the wind through windows that don't hum. I want to cook with you, burn something in the oven. Laugh about it. And so he brought her home. The apartment wasn't much, but it was theirs. James filled it with warmth, books, candles, fresh flowers every morning. Emily wore her softest sweaters and mismatched socks. They played vinyl records from their college days. They lived. One night, she made peanut butter sandwiches. They sat on the floor, like they had once done years ago, under string lights. I'm not afraid, Emily said suddenly. James looked at her, his voice barely a breath. Of what? Of going. Just of not getting to love you longer. He didn't cry, he simply kissed her knuckles. You've loved me enough for 10 lifetimes. She leaned into him. Then let's keep going. One more day, and then another. And so they did. The candle didn't burn out. It burned slow, bright, and beautiful. The air was cooler now. Autumn had crept into the city like a secret, turning leaves gold and red outside their apartment window. Emily loved this season. She always said fall was the most honest time of year, the one where things showed their true colors before letting go. She moved slower now, each step cost her. But she refused the wheelchair James had offered. Not yet, she said. Let me walk towards something while I still can. So James adjusted his pace. He learned to wait at doorways and hold her waist without making her feel weak. They watched the sunrise every morning. Emily said she liked to count the seconds it took for light to touch the rooftop across the street. One day, she said, I'll count to 10, and when the light hits, I'll be gone. James didn't answer, because love, when it's this deep, doesn't argue with time. It just listens. That night, Emily wrote letters, one for Sophie, one for her mother, and one for James. She sealed each envelope with wax and placed them in the drawer beside the bed. Then she turned to James. I want tomorrow to be normal, she said. He looked at her, holding back the storm in his chest. What's normal? You, she whispered, making pancakes while burning them. Me, sitting on the counter laughing. And maybe if the sky allows one more Polaroid. James nodded, tears pooling but not falling. He kissed her forehead and whispered, then tomorrow, my love, I'll make the worst pancakes you've ever had. And she smiled, because even on the edge of the unknown, there was warmth in the promise of morning. James woke before the sun. He moved quietly, careful not to wake her. In the kitchen, he cracked eggs with shaking hands and burned the first 2 pancakes exactly as promised. The scent of scorched batter filled the apartment like a memory. Emily entered slowly, wrapped in her cardigan, her steps steady but soft. You're terrible at this, she teased. He grinned. It's part of the charm. They ate at the small table by the window. Emily didn't finish her plate, but she laughed between sips of tea, and James didn't look away once as the sky began to warm. She stood and walked to the balcony. James followed. They stood there in silence, watching as the first ray of light crept over the buildings. Emily whispered, 1, 2. James joined, his voice trembling. 3, 4. They reached 10, and the light kissed the rooftop. But she didn't let go. Not yet. Instead, she turned to him, her eyes clear and full of something eternal. Now, she said, take the picture. He raised the Polaroid, clicked. And for the rest of his life, James would remember that moment, not as the day she left, but the day she chose to stay for just a little while longer. That afternoon, the apartment was quiet. James read to her from their favorite book, Old Pages, soft with Use, the kind of story where nothing much happens, but everything matters. Emily's head rested on his lap, her breathing slow, steady, and though the world turned noisy and cruel, James read, they found a little peace in each other's presence, like the hush of snow on pine. Emily smiled faintly. That line always gets me. James closed the book. You always said it felt like home. It still does. She shifted slightly, wincing. Pain? He asked, only a whisper. He touched her forehead gently. Then I'll stay very still, so the whisper doesn't turn into thunder. Outside, the sky dimmed. Autumn shadows stretched long and gold across their living room floor. Emily's eyes fluttered closed. Tell me something happy, she murmured. James thought for a moment. When you laughed during our first kiss and bit my lip by accident, she chuckled. You tasted like fear and peppermint, he grinned. You tasted like forever. Then quieter, you still do. Silence wrapped around them like a blanket. James watched her chest rise and fall, one breath, then another, then still. But he didn't move. He waited, listened, and in the softest voice he'd ever heard, she whispered, still here. James didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, not even grief, but reverence. He sat beside Emily as the hours folded inward, watching the small rise and fall of her chest, her lips parted in the kind of sleep that didn't stir with dreams. And then, in the blue hush before dawn, that stillness came, the kind that doesn't move, doesn't breathe, doesn't need to. He felt it not like something breaking, but like something being gently released. James didn't cry. He spoke. Thank you. He kissed her forehead, and then, like they had planned, he took one last Polaroid, not of her face, but of her hand, curled softly over the edge of the blanket, the silver bracelet glinting in the first light of morning. That photo would remain in his wallet for the rest of his life. The funeral was quiet. No press, no spectacle, just Sophie, Margaret's old friend from Oregon, James, and a few neighbors who had brought soup over during Emily's final weeks. She was buried under a maple tree, one whose leaves blushed crimson every October, the season she loved most. James stood by the grave, wind in his coat, hands shaking, not from cold, but from memory. He didn't say goodbye. He said, I'll keep going. And he meant it. Back at the apartment, everything remained as she left it. Her book on the armrest, a pair of socks draped over the heater, the faint smell of peppermint tea still clinging to the kitchen. James didn't erase her. He carried her in notes tucked inside his coat, in bracelets wrapped twice around his wrist, in the echoes of laughter on voice recordings he couldn't bring himself to delete. He grieved loudly, then silently, then quietly again, until one morning, years later, he opened her last letter. It began, if you're reading this, it means I kept my promise. I stayed until the light touched the rooftop, and ended, live so full that my absence feels like a shadow, not a hole. Because love doesn't leave, it lingers. He pressed the paper to his lips, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. It took James a year to return to his work. The company had survived the media storm, but James stepped down shortly after Emily's funeral. He handed the reins to his most trusted partner and walked away, not out of defeat, but in search of something more enduring. He moved to Oregon, back to the town where it began, back to the library where he first saw her beneath gray skies. James bought a small plot of land just outside the city, where pine trees whispered in the wind and the ground smelled of old earth, the scent Emily had always loved. There, he began building, not skyscrapers, not office towers, homes, affordable, beautiful, resilient homes, inspired by the sketchbook he and Emily once filled with dreams and doodles. Every blueprint bore a signature in the corner, E+J still here. It started with one house, then 5, then a whole community. People came. Volunteers, architects, single parents, artists, students. They called it the Carter Project, a place built not just with nails and beams, but with memory and purpose. James kept the Polaroids in his workshop. He taught a design class at the local college once a week, quoting Emily's favorite authors, making students laugh with stories about peanut butter sandwiches and burned pancakes. And every year, on the first day of fall, he walked to the maple tree where she rested. He brought peppermint tea, a new book, and one more photo. Sometimes he cried. More often, he smiled, because she hadn't disappeared. She had become the foundation, and James was still building. The Carter Project expanded quietly, like roots beneath the soil. James never sought press coverage, but people talked about the man who built houses with open porches and windows that caught the morning light just right, about how each home came with a story, and how every front door bore a small engraved plate, still here. In year 3, a filmmaker came to town. Her name was Natalie Chen, a documentarian known for telling stories that never made the front page. She approached James at a college lecture, holding a notebook and a quiet determination. I want to tell your story, she said. James shook his head. It's not my story anymore. Exactly, Natalie replied. It belongs to everyone now. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. Over the next 6 months, Natalie filmed the houses, the community meals, the children painting murals. The workshops where volunteers left poems tucked between bricks. She interviewed James last. They sat under the maple tree. What do you think she'd say if she saw all this? Natalie asked. James looked up, watching a leaf drift down. She'd probably call it a beginning disguised as an ending. Natalie smiled. That sounds like something from her letters. James nodded. She was the only person I ever knew who could turn goodbye into a seed. The documentary aired the following spring. It didn't go viral. It went deeper. People across the country wrote in. Families, students, survivors, architects, each one with a version of the same message. I thought I was alone. The Carter Project grew. Donations poured in. Students interned. A second site opened in Montana, then Colorado, then Maine, and James stayed rooted in Oregon, always returning to the beginning. Because grief doesn't end. It builds, layer by layer, echo by echo, brick by memory-rich brick. 5 years after the first Carter house was built, a letter arrived, not to James, but to the town library. It was from a girl named Ava, 14, who had moved into one of the Carter homes with her mother. Her father had passed the previous winter, and her world had crumbled. Until the house, until the town, until the mural she painted on her bedroom wall of a girl on a rooftop, counting the seconds to sunlight. She wrote, I didn't know who Emily Carter was until I moved here. But now I think of her every morning. I count the light, just like she did. And I think maybe I'll be okay too. James read the letter in the quiet corner of the library where Emily once waited out storms with a chipped mug and peppermint tea. He folded the paper gently and placed it in a leather-bound journal, Emily's last one. The pages were mostly empty, except for a title she had written on the first page, When Grief Grows Gardens. That evening, James visited the garden at the center of the Carter Project, the one built around the oldest tree, where wind chimes whispered. Like memory, he sat on the bench and opened the journal, and for the first time, began to write beside her, page by page, seed by seed. He wrote letters to people he hadn't met, to those still in darkness, to those searching for light. And soon, others began writing too, residents, builders, volunteers, each one adding their grief and growth to the pages. The journal stayed in the garden chapel, open to anyone. It became a living archive, a place not of endings, but of continuing, because Emily hadn't just built homes through James, she had built a legacy through hearts, and long after her voice had faded, her words still found ways to bloom. On the 10th anniversary of Emily's passing, the Carter Project held its largest gathering yet. Families flew in from across the country. Some had lived in Carter homes for years, others had just moved in. There were children who had grown up under those roofs, now teenagers, carrying stories in their pockets. James stood on a small wooden stage built in the garden, beneath the maple tree. It was late afternoon, the sky golden, and the air was thick with both memory and gratitude. He held Emily's journal in his hands. 10 years ago, he began, I lost the love of my life, but she didn't leave. Not really. She planted something, and every one of you is proof that she's still growing. Silence held, and then, applause. Not the kind of clapping meant for performance but for presence. Later that night, the community gathered for a lantern ceremony. Hundreds of paper lanterns were lit, each one inscribed with a name, a prayer, or a promise. James's lantern carried just 2 words. Still here. As the lanterns floated upward, carried by heat and hope, James watched Ava, now 19, read aloud from the garden journal. Her voice was steady, her eyes lit with the same fire Emily once had, and in that moment, James didn't feel alone. He felt surrounded. By legacy, by light, by her. Because love like that doesn't vanish. It becomes a sky, endless, and filled with stars that whisper, still here.